there's already been an independence referendum, and you lost that one. Scotland voted to stay within the UK. There's already been a Brexit referendum, and the UK voted to come out of the EU. So people might be wondering what your issue is with the result of democratic referendums.
Well, let me take each in turn, Susanna, because they're both very fair questions. On the 2014 independence referendum, absolutely, my side lost that. We lost it perhaps more narrowly than people had thought we would. But things have changed quite markedly since then. During that referendum, one of the key arguments of the No campaign was if we voted for independence, we'd get thrown out of the European Union. Now we face being taken out of the European Union against our will. So circumstances change, and when circumstances change, I would argue that people in a democracy have the right to change their mind.
Okay,
and
so
fast forward to the 2016 Brexit vote. Well, let me answer that part of your question, because Scotland in that referendum, of course, didn't vote to leave the EU. We voted to remain in the EU. So if there is an opportunity, and I don't know whether that opportunity will arise, for Scotland to reaffirm its view there, then yes, SNP MPs would vote to take that.
But Scotland, of course, voted to stay within the UK, which means that when referendums are held in the UK, you know, unfortunately for you as First Minister of Scotland, it's the whole UK vote that's taken into account. Sure. Would you say that you now think it's time for another referendum on independence for Scotland because circumstances have changed? But can you, in your heart of hearts, say that you wouldn't have wanted another referendum on independence for Scotland even if the UK had stayed in the EU?
Oh, look, Susanna, I'm not going to stand here and pretend to you that I don't want independence. I've campaigned for independence all of my life. I believe it's the right future for Scotland.
So actually it's got nothing to do with the EU,
if the Brexit vote hadn't happened... Well, no, if perhaps, just let me finish the point. If Brexit hadn't happened, I do think it would be very difficult for me to stand here at this stage and suggest another referendum on independence. The Brexit vote really highlighted, I suppose, what was one of the key arguments at the heart of the independence campaign, which is a democratic deficit. Scotland's voice is not heard, and I take your point. Brexit was a UK-wide referendum, and we are bound by the UK-wide result. But Scotland's a nation. We have a voice of our own, and it's very frustrating when that voice is completely cast aside. And all of the efforts at compromise we've made since then, arguing to stay in the single market, for example, have simply been dismissed by the UK government. So, you know, democracy is not a fixed point in time. Circumstances change, and people have a right to change their mind. Now, it would be always up to the people of Scotland whether they want to take that opportunity to be independent. But it is undeniable, I think, that since 2014, circumstances have changed quite significantly.
I'll tell you what has changed significantly is the disparity between the economic performance of Scotland under your masterful leadership and the rest of the UK, because Scotland's deficit is equivalent to 7.9% of GDP last year. For the rest of the UK, or as the UK as a whole, 1.9%. Why would Scots people, with great respect to you, Nicola Sturgeon, want you to lead them into the brave world of independence if that's been your record in the last few years?
Again, very fair questions, Piers. I would suggest, though, you're not quite bang up to date on these figures. To take Scotland's deficit firstly, Scotland's deficit is reducing. We had figures out just over the summer which shows that Scotland's onshore revenues and now our offshore revenues are rising. The deficit is reducing.
Well, the deficit... Well, hang on. The deficit for the year was 13.4 billion compared with 13.5 billion the year before. I mean, come on. You're splitting hairs, Ms Sturgeon.
Well, I'm saying it's reducing, but I was also going to make the point, if you, again, let me make the point, is that Scotland's economy over the past year now has been growing faster than the UK's. Scotland's international exports are growing faster than the UK's. We've got very low unemployment, very high unemployment. If you take female employment and youth employment, Scotland performs better than the rest of the UK. We've more or less closed the productivity gap between Scotland and the UK that was a big issue for a long time. The final point to make here, though, and it's an important one, is when you look at deficits and the fiscal position of Scotland, that, of course, is a feature of how we're governed right now as part of the Westminster system. Macroeconomic policy is not a responsibility of the Scottish Government, it's a Westminster responsibility. So if we've got a big deficit as a result of that, I would argue that that's maybe not an argument for staying the same.
But
that
why,
could well be an
but
argument
why
for
are you
change.
so wedded to the idea of a European Union with a lot of countries coming together and working en masse to resolve big issues like fiscal problems, and yet so ideologically opposed to the idea of the United Kingdom, which is, of course, a smaller version of the European Union? It seems to me that your unionist blood swings both ways.
Well, look, I believe very strongly, firstly, that an independent Scotland would cooperate very, very closely with other countries across the UK, the British Isles. We'd just do so on the basis of equality. We'd have an equal voice and we'd cooperate as an equal part of that family of nations. And to extend that principle, I believe that independent countries, I want Scotland to be one of those independent countries, should cooperate for the greater good through multilateral organisations like the European Union. Take the report out this morning from the UN on climate change, a really good example of how no country, and Scotland's doing a lot of world-leading work in tackling climate change, but no single country can tackle something like that on its own. So I want to see an independent Scotland cooperate across the British Isles, but also cooperate across Europe and the wider world, and that is a perfectly consistent position to take.
You think it's perfectly consistent. Lots of people don't. The SNP believes EU membership delivers social, economic, cultural benefits for individuals, business and communities across Scotland. But you're part of a union of 4 nations within the UK in which you have huge influence at, not just at national level, but also in Westminster. However, many people see the EU as completely undemocratic compared to the sort of influence you have on democracy within the UK. Trade with the UK, Scotland's trade within the UK, worth more than 4 times your exports to the EU. 49.8 billion you export to the rest of the UK back in 2015 compared to exports to the EU, 12.3 billion. You benefit, Scotland benefits hugely, economically, culturally, politically, democratically, by being part of that union that you want to get out of in order to stay part of a union you get less out of.
Look, there's lots of points in there that you've made that I would actually agree with. So I think there are cultural and social benefits for Scotland cooperating with other nations across the UK. Yes, our trade to the rest of the UK is important. The rest of the UK's trade to Scotland is important, and I don't want to interrupt that. But the EU single market is 8 times the size of the UK market. We shouldn't have to choose one over the other. What I want to do within the UK, the British Isles, is to cooperate on a basis of equality. You say we've got huge influence. Scotland voted 62% to remain in the EU, and yet we're a matter of months away of being taken out of the EU. All of our attempts at putting compromise proposals on the table have been dismissed by the UK government. Contrast Scotland and Ireland right now. Ireland, as an independent member of the EU, has been shown complete solidarity by its colleagues across the EU. Scotland has been dismissed by the Westminster system. So I want Scotland not to turn its back on the rest of the UK, certainly not to turn its back on Europe, but to cooperate on the basis of equality, where we have political independence and can make our voice heard. And I think that is a very compelling argument. The polls that we've seen most recently will suggest it's an argument winning more and more support from the people of Scotland. But ultimately, of course, it will be for the people of Scotland to decide.
One thing you will need, Nicola Sturgeon, and if you do go independent, is successful business people to invest in Scotland. You'd agree with that, right?
Absolutely.
So will you be welcoming President Donald Trump to make more substantial investments in your independent Scotland, should that eventuality happen?
I know he's a big pal of yours, Piers, so I'm not surprised you're taking the opportunity to argue his case
I'm not
to me this
arguing
morning.
anything.
Of course, Donald Trump,
simply asking a simple question.
If Donald Trump wants to invest more in Scotland, I'm sure he will be able to do that. He's got 2 golf courses in Scotland. I'm not sure if you've been here to play either of them.
I've just been up in your wonderful country. I've just spent 4 days playing golf. You're always welcome, and I'm just a bit offended that you didn't call me up while you were here so that we could have got together. But, Donald Trump is the President of the United States. I respect that. I have deep and profound political disagreements with him, and I will continue, where appropriate, to voice those disagreements. That, after all, is what democracy is all about. Absolutely. I only asked if he would welcome more investment from Donald Trump. Would you welcome it?
I welcome investment from Look, I welcome investment from wherever it comes. We, believe in encouraging people to come to Scotland. We believe in ethical investment, but we also believe we should be free to speak our minds where we disagree with people. And Donald Trump is the elected President of the United States, but I reserve the right to disagree with them strongly. And I've watched events in the United States over the past few days and found myself disagreeing very strongly.
So you'd hold your nose and take his cash?
Look, I'm sure you enjoy playing his golf courses, and I'm sure many people enjoy playing his golf courses.
Do you have plans of unleashing the Sturgeon bot?
Perhaps there's some proclaimers?
Well, Susanna, I know you've obviously got dancing expertise from Strictly Come Dancing, but if I was to come onto the stage tomorrow dancing, all I would say is when that happened, Theresa May's dance would no longer be the worst in the world. I would probably beat her to that title. So I will perhaps resist the temptation to try to get into that kind of competition.